Hey guys, tonight we are opening a door that has been quietly locked for nearly a century. You think you know Laura Ingalls Wilder. You grew up with her. Maybe you read her books by flashlight under the covers, or you watched her on television. That little girl with the braids, running through tall grass, living a life that seemed so honest, so pure, so completely American that it felt less like a story and more like a memory that belonged to all of us somehow. The covered wagon, the fiddle music at night, the cosy log cabin full of love and warmth, Pa with his gentle wisdom, Ma with her quiet grace, and Laura, stubborn, bright, laughing Laura, growing up on the wide, open frontier, building a life out of hard work and good values and nothing else. That is the version of the story that sold 60 million copies. That is the version that shaped how generations of Americans understood the frontier, what it looked like, who lived there, what it meant to be a pioneer. And tonight we are going to tell you what was really going on. Because here's the thing about those beloved books. They were not written by a little girl on the prairie. They were written by a woman in her 60s, living through the Great Depression, working alongside her daughter, a nationally published author with strong political opinions and a very clear idea of what kind of story America needed to hear. They were written 50 years after the events they describe, shaped by memory and politics and the demands of the publishing industry and the beliefs of two women who were convinced that the world would be better off believing in rugged, self-sufficient, pull yourself up by your bootstraps pioneer families. The real neighbours, they were more complicated. The real story. It has a black doctor who saved the Ingalls family from dying of malaria, a man who delivered one of Laura's sisters, who lived less than a mile away, who practiced medicine in that county for decades, and who appears in exactly one chapter across 8 novels. One chapter, in 18 years of Laura's life. The real story has a villain who was never one person. She was 3 different girls from 3 different towns, smashed together into one blonde, bratty, fictional composite. The real story has a beloved friend who may never have existed as written, a man whose very name was changed between the original manuscript and the published book. The real story has a father who moved his family 14 times in 20 years, who squatted illegally on land that did not belong to him, who may have ridden with vigilantes on a dark night and come home with blood on his conscience, and who was transformed through the careful editing of 2 politically motivated women into one of the most beloved and idealized fathers in the history of American literature. And the real story has a piece of land, the land those famous Little House books begin on, that did not belong to white settlers at all. It belonged to the Osage Nation. It was protected by treaty. And the Ingalls family was squatting there illegally. That is what we are going to talk about tonight. Not to take something away from you, not to ruin anything, but because the real story, the messy, complicated, heartbreaking, occasionally dark and genuinely remarkable real story, is so much more interesting than the cleaned-up version that it would be a crime to keep it from you. So get comfortable. This is going to be a long night, and I promise you, by the time we are done, you will never look at a prairie sunset the same way again. Here is something else you should know before we go any further. The complaints have been rolling in. Viewers saying the information is wrong. Viewers saying the script sounds like a machine wrote it. Viewers saying essential words are missing, that sentences fall apart midway through, that something is off, that the story being told does not quite match the history they know. They are right to notice, and tonight that stops. Every single fact in this video has been verified against historical records. Birth certificates, federal census data, land claim documents, newspaper accounts from the 1870s and 1880s, scholarly biographies, the annotated edition of Laura's original Pioneer Girl manuscript, published by the South Dakota State Historical Society Press in 2014, medical journals, cemetery records, gravestone inscriptions, court documents. If it is in this video, it is real. If it was uncertain, we said so. If it was disputed among scholars, we told you that too. There is plenty of remarkable truth in this story without needing to invent a single word of it. Now, let us go. Let us start at the beginning. The real beginning, February 7th, 1867, Pepin County, Wisconsin. A baby girl is born in a little log cabin in the big woods. Her name is Laura Elizabeth Ingalls, and she's the second daughter of Charles Philip Ingalls and Caroline Lake Quiner Ingalls. She is healthy, she is loud, and she has absolutely no idea that 65 years from now, she's going to sit down at a kitchen table in Mansfield, Missouri, pick up a pencil, and start writing a version of her childhood that will become one of the most beloved, most read, and, as it turns out, most carefully constructed pieces of historical fiction that America has ever produced. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. In 1867, Laura is just a baby, and her father, Charles, Pa, is already restless. Charles Ingalls was, by all accounts, a genuinely charming man. He played the fiddle beautifully. He told wonderful stories. He had laughing eyes and a warm voice and an enormous amount of love for his daughters. These things are true. These things Laura did not invent, but Charles Ingalls also had what his daughter would later, in her adult letters, call itchy feet. He could not stay in one place. He could not look at a piece of land he had already broken and improved and be satisfied with what he had built there. He always needed to know what was over the next rise, beyond the next county line, in the next territory that the government was opening to settlers. In roughly 20 years, he moved his family at least 14 times. 14! Think about that for a moment. 14 moves, 14 times. Caroline Ingalls packed up her household, loaded her children into a wagon, and followed her husband somewhere new. 14 times the girl said goodbye to friends, to neighbours, to the small, hard-won sense of community that frontier families depended on to survive. 14 times they started over. The books present these moves as logical, necessary responses to circumstances, grasshopper plagues, hard winters, opportunities for better land. And some of that is true. The frontier was brutal, and families did get pushed around by forces outside their control. But the books do not tell you that Caroline Ingalls probably hated it. They do not tell you that she had no legal right to refuse. In the 1870s and 1880s, a married woman's property and choices belonged to her husband. If Charles said we are moving, they moved. Her feelings about it have been almost entirely lost to history, because nobody thought to write them down. And because the woman who wrote the books loved her father more than she was willing to complicate him. We will come back to Pa. He deserves his own chapter, and he is going to get one. For now, understand this. The family you fell in love with was real. The love was real. The fiddle music was real. The hard winters and the grasshoppers and the desperate grinding poverty and the moments of genuine joy, all of it was real. But the narrative, the carefully shaped story of a brave, wise, self-sufficient pioneer family who built their life with nothing but their own hands and their own virtue, that narrative was constructed. It was built deliberately, piece by piece, in the 1930s and 1940s, by two women who had very specific ideas about what America needed to believe about itself. And in building that narrative, they made choices. They included some people and left out others. They softened some characters and sharpened others. They gave some neighbours names and stories and let others vanish without a trace. They took real, complicated human beings, some of them remarkable, some of them ordinary, some of them extraordinary in ways that the books could not afford to acknowledge, and they made decisions about which of those people fit the story they were telling. Tonight, we're going to find the ones who did not make the cut, or who barely made it, or who made it, but with their names changed, their origins altered, their real significance quietly buried beneath a more convenient version of events. Before we get into the specific people, and we will in detail, I promise you, you need to understand the machinery behind these books, because understanding how they were made is the only way to understand why the real neighbours look so different from the fictional ones. In 1930, Laura Ingalls Wilder was 63 years old. She'd been living on Rocky Ridge Farm in Mansfield, Missouri for decades. She'd tried her hand at various kinds of writing, newspaper columns, agricultural articles, but she had never written a book. Her daughter Rose Wilder Lane, however, was by then a famous and successful author. Rose had travelled the world, published novels, written for major magazines. She was sharp, opinionated, and deeply, passionately committed to a particular political philosophy. The belief that individuals should be free from government interference, that communities succeed through self-reliance rather than collective assistance, that the story of America was fundamentally the story of rugged individuals pulling themselves up from nothing. Rose had watched the Great Depression hammer ordinary Americans. She had watched Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal expand government programs and government involvement in daily life, and she believed, fiercely, publicly, controversially, that this was exactly the wrong direction for the country. Into this moment her mother handed her a pencil-written manuscript. 400 pages scrawled on school tablets. Laura called it Pioneer Girl. It was the story of her childhood, raw, unpolished, and far more honest than anything that would eventually be published. It included the Bender family, America's first known serial killers, at whose property the Ingalls had stopped multiple times without knowing what lay buried in the garden. It included a period in Burr Oak, Iowa, a difficult, humiliating time when Charles ran a hotel and the family witnessed alcoholism and domestic violence, and a man who burned himself to death after drinking too much. It included Dr. George Tann, the black physician who lived less than a mile away, who had saved the entire family from dying of malaria, and who had delivered baby Carrie on August 3rd, 1870. Publishers looked at Pioneer Girl and passed. The raw material was there, they said, but not in the right form. Rose went to work. What emerged between 1932 and 1943 was 8 novels. Little House in the Big Woods, Little House on the Prairie, On the Banks of Plum Creek, and so on through these happy golden years. Beloved. Award-winning, read by children all over the world, and carefully, deliberately shaped. The Bender murders vanished. The Burr Oak period vanished. Dr. Tann shrank from a near neighbour and lifelong fixture of their Kansas community to a man who appeared in a single chapter, was described primarily by his race, and never appeared again. Multiple real girls who had genuinely antagonized young Laura were merged into a single, memorable villain who followed her conveniently across state lines. A beloved helper named, in Laura's original manuscript, Mr. Brown, had his name changed to Mr. Edwards, and was given a romantic Tennessee origin that he did not actually possess, then reappeared hundreds of miles and a decade later in Dakota Territory, as though the Prairie were a small village where everybody kept running into each other. None of these changes happened by accident. All of them served the larger story that Wilder and Lane were telling, a story about white, self-reliant, nuclear family pioneer life that left out the black doctor, minimised the indigenous people whose land had been taken, softened the father's restlessness and failure, and made the whole messy, violent, community-dependent, government-assisted reality of frontier life into something clean and golden and inspiring. It worked. Beautifully, extraordinarily it worked. 60 million copies sold. A television series that ran for 9 years. A place in the American cultural mythology so deep that politicians still invoke the spirit of the frontier, the self-made pioneer family, the rugged individual, without knowing they are invoking, in part, an image that was constructed in the 1930s by 2 women with a political agenda and a very good story. Now, here is where it gets really interesting, because the people who were left out, or changed, or softened, or compressed into convenient composites, they did not simply disappear. They lived their lives. They left records. They appear in census data and land claim documents and birth certificates and newspaper obituaries and cemetery registries, and, in one extraordinary case, on a gravestone inscription that identifies a man specifically as the Black Doctor who doctored the Ingalls family for malaria in 1870. The evidence is there. Scholars have been finding it for decades. And, since 2014, when Laura's original Pioneer Girl manuscript was finally published in an annotated edition, the picture has become astonishingly clear. The real neighbours are waiting. They have been waiting for 100 years, and tonight we're going to introduce them. We're going to start with the villain, because she was never one person, and the 3 real girls who got folded into her, deserved to be known as the complicated individual human beings they actually were. Not as one bratty blonde with curly hair and a fancy store-bought dress, but as Nellie Owens and Genevieve Masters and Estella Gilbert, 3 separate women in 3 separate places, living 3 separate lives that were reduced without their consent into a single memorable antagonist. Then we're going to talk about the Doctor, the man who saved 5 lives and delivered a baby and spent 30 years serving his community, black and white and Osage alike, and who got 1 chapter and a misspelled name. Then we're going to find Mr. Edwards. Or rather, we're going to look very carefully at the places where Mr. Edwards should be and discover that what is actually there is a gap, a name change, and a census record listing a 25-year-old English bachelor named Edmund Mason, who is buried in a cemetery near the Little House site, and who has never once been featured on the cover of a children's book. Then we're going to sit with Pa, because he deserves the complicated portrait that his daughter never quite gave him. And then we're going to talk about the land itself, the land the Little House books begin on, the Osage land, the treaty-protected, illegally occupied, federally disputed land that a family of squatters built a cabin on while the rightful owners watched from a careful distance and the United States government tried to figure out whose side to take. By the time we are done, you will know the real story. Not the one that sold 60 million copies, the one that happened. Stay with me. We're just getting started. One more thing before we dive in, and this matters. Look at the world Laura was writing into in 1932. The Great Depression had been grinding for 3 years. Millions of Americans had lost everything. Banks had failed. Farms had failed. Men who had spent their whole lives believing that hard work was enough, that if you kept your head down and put in the hours and did everything right, the world would reward you, as for standing in bread lines wearing the same clothes they had worn to their last day of work. Into this moment, Laura and Rose offered something that Americans desperately needed. Not charity, not sympathy, hope. Specifically, the kind of hope that comes from a story about a family who had nothing, who faced everything, and who made it through on their own terms. The timing was not coincidental. The Ingalls family had been genuinely poor. Poorer than the books quite let on, and poorer for longer. Charles Ingalls died in 1902 in De Smet, South Dakota, after a lifetime of land claims and restless moves and ventures that never quite paid off. He was not wealthy. He had never achieved the settled prosperity he was always certain the next piece of land would provide. But in the books, that story becomes something different. It becomes proof that the American frontier rewards virtue and effort. It becomes an argument against despair. It becomes, in the hands of Rose Wilder Lane, who was simultaneously writing political manifestos arguing against New Deal government assistance, a demonstration that real Americans did not need government help. They built cabins with their own hands. They survived hard winters on their own courage. They were self-made through and through, except, of course, they were not. The Homestead Act that gave Charles Ingalls his land claims was a massive government program, distributing 270 million acres of territory to settlers, territory that had been taken, by force and by treaty violations, from indigenous nations. Either the railroad that brought settlers to Dakota Territory received enormous government land grants and subsidies. The land office where Almanzo Wilder filed his claims was a federal institution. The school that Mary Ingalls attended for the blind, the one that Laura worked so hard to help pay for, was a state institution. Government was everywhere in the pioneer experience, but you would not know it from the books, because the books were telling a different story, a cleaner, more useful, more politically convenient story. And the neighbours who did not fit that story, they got left on the cutting room floor. Now, let's go find them. We're going to start with the villain, because she was never one person, and the 3 real girls who got folded into her deserve to be known as the complicated. Individual human beings they actually were. Not as one bratty blonde with curly hair and a fancy store-bought dress, but as Nellie Owens and Genevieve Masters and Estella Gilbert, 3 separate women in 3 separate places, living 3 separate lives that were reduced without their consent into a single memorable antagonist. Their names were Nellie Owens, Genevieve Masters, Estella Gilbert, and not one of them was ever told she was being filed away into a shared identity without her knowledge or her consent. Then we're going to talk about the Doctor, the man who saved 5 lives and delivered a baby and spent 30 years serving his community, black and white and Osage alike, and who got 1 chapter and a misspelled name. Then we're going to find Mr. Edwards, or rather, we're going to look very carefully at the places where Mr. Edwards should be, and discover that what is actually there is a gap, a name change, and a census record listing a 25-year-old English bachelor named Edmund Mason, who is buried in a cemetery near the Little House site, and who has never once been featured on the cover of a children's book. Then we're going to sit with Pa, because he deserves the complicated portrait that his daughter never quite gave him. And then we're going to talk about the land itself, the Osage land, the treaty-protected, illegally occupied, federally disputed land that a family of squatters built a famous cabin on, while the rightful owners watched from a careful distance. By the time we are done, you will know the real story, not the one that sold 60 million copies, the one that happened. Stay with me. We're just getting started. Let us talk about Nellie Oleson. If you read the Little House books, or watch the television series, you know exactly who she is. The ringlets, the smirk, the silk ribbons and the store-bought dress and the way she looked at Laura like Laura was something stuck to the bottom of her shoe. The girl whose father owned the general store, whose mother let her get away with absolutely everything, who mocked Laura's handmade clothes and her calloused hands and her country ways, with a confidence that only comes from someone who has never once worried about money in her life. She is one of the most memorable villains in American children's literature. She is the girl every reader has loved to hate for almost 90 years. She inspired the character that actress Alison Arngrim made famous on television. Mean, manipulative, hilariously awful, and completely unforgettable. Here is what you do not know. Nellie Oleson never existed. Not one single person, not one real name, not one real face behind those fictional ringlets. She was 3 women, 3 separate human beings living in 3 separate places, who had their individual lives, their own complicated stories, their own adult futures, and were pressed together without their consent into one blonde, sneering composite who followed fictional Laura Ingalls across hundreds of miles of prairie as though she had nothing better to do. Their names were Nellie Owens, Genevieve Masters, and Estella Gilbert, and every single one of them was far more interesting than the character who replaced them. Let us start with the original, the name giver, the girl who provided Nellie Oleson with the most important thing of all, her name, Walnut Grove, Minnesota. 1874. The Ingalls family has just arrived, fresh from their covered wagon, settling near Plum Creek in Redwood County. It is a small town, the way all frontier towns are small, a handful of buildings, a church, a school, a general store, and that general store belongs to a man named Owens. His daughter is Nellie. Nellie Owens is real. Her father really does own the store. Her brother Willie is real too, and he shows up in the books, his name unchanged, because apparently Laura did not feel it necessary to disguise him. Federal census records for Walnut Grove, Minnesota confirm the Owens family presence in that community. School attendance records place Nellie in the same classroom as Laura. She's not a ghost. She's not an invention. She's a real documented girl who sat in a real schoolroom and, by Laura's own later letters, was rude and selfish. But here is the thing about Nellie Owens. She stayed in Minnesota. When the Ingalls family loaded their wagon and moved on, as they always did, Nellie Owens did not follow. She had no reason to follow. She had her own life, her own town, her own story. She grew up in Minnesota. She eventually lived to the age of 80. So when the fictional Nellie Oleson shows up again in the Dakota Territory books, hundreds of miles from Walnut Grove, reappearing in Laura's life as though she had been magnetically attached to the Ingalls family wagon, that is not Nellie Owens. That is someone else entirely. And here is where it gets really interesting. Meet Genevieve Masters. Genevieve was born on November 12th, 1867 in Hornby, Steuben County, New York. She was the daughter of the schoolteacher in Walnut Grove, which meant she and Laura were at the same school at the same time and did not much like each other. Laura's original Pioneer Girl manuscript, written in 1930 and published in its annotated edition in 2014, describes Genevieve in terms that are considerably more vivid than anything that made it into the children's books. Laura wrote that Genevieve sneered at the other girls because, in Genevieve's estimation, they were merely Westerners. She was from New York and she wanted everyone to know it. She wore fancier clothes than the Prairie girls. She spoke with a slight lisp. And she was, in Laura's own words, far nastier than Nellie Owens had been. Far nastier. Those are Laura Ingalls Wilder's words. About a real person. A real girl who sat in her classroom and made her feel the particular, grinding sting of being looked down on by someone who had more money, more fashionable clothes, and an absolutely unshakable certainty that where she came from was simply better. Now, here is the twist that Laura could not have planned for, and that made Genevieve Masters so narratively useful. When the Ingalls family eventually left Walnut Grove and moved to De Smet in Dakota Territory, they assumed they were leaving their social troubles behind. They were not. The Masters family moved too. Genevieve appeared in De Smet, the same town, a new chapter, the same sneering attitude in a new landscape. And suddenly, the fictional possibility of a single villain who followed Laura from Minnesota to Dakota became not just plausible, but structurally elegant. In the books, when Nellie Oleson reappears in De Smet, readers feel a jolt of dark recognition. Oh, she's back. The worst girl from childhood, arriving uninvited in the new town, ready to make Laura's life difficult all over again. In reality, it was Genevieve Masters who showed up in De Smet, and Genevieve Masters who became the primary inspiration for the intellectual rivalry, the snobbishness about Eastern superiority, the sense that this particular antagonist would simply not go away. Genevieve eventually moved to Chicago. She married a man named William Renwick. She had one daughter, Margaret, who was born in 1900, and on November the 7th, 1909, just 5 days before what would have been her 42nd birthday, Genevieve Masters Renwick died of pneumonia in Chicago. She was 41 years old. Her remains were brought back to De Smet, South Dakota, and buried in the local cemetery, the same Dakota Territory ground she had walked on as a girl, arguing with Laura Ingalls about whether New York was better than the frontier. When Laura, in a form letter she sent to the hundreds of children who wrote to her each month, described Nellie Oleson as someone who moved back east and did not live many years, she was describing Genevieve Masters, not the character, the real woman, the real girl who had been the nastiest of the three originals, who had bragged about New York and worn the right clothes and made Laura feel the sharp bite of class difference, and who had died young and far from home. There is something almost unbearably poignant in that sentence if you know who she is really talking about. Now pay attention, because the third girl is the one that almost nobody talks about, and she is the one with the most dramatic real-life connection to the Little House story. Her name was Estella Gilbert. She went by Stella. Stella was born in May of 1864, which made her a few years older than Laura. She lived on a claim just north of the Ingalls property in De Smet, Dakota Territory. She was, by accounts of the time, very attractive, and she had a mother who was ill and largely bedridden, which meant that Almanzo Wilder, being a generally decent young man, sometimes brought Stella along on his buggy rides as a social courtesy. The same buggy rides where he was also courting Laura. You understand the problem. In the books, Nellie Oleson, already established as the familiar villain, is inserted into this role. She becomes the interloper on the buggy rides, the unwelcome third party, the woman angling for Almanzo's attention while Laura sits there trying to keep her temper. It makes for wonderful drama. It gives the books a love triangle edge that keeps the reader anxious about whether Laura and Almanzo will actually end up together. But in real life, it was Stella Gilbert. A real woman with a sick mother and a difficult life, and no particular malicious intent as far as historical records can tell us. She was simply a neighbour, caught up in a social situation that later got reframed as villainy because it made for better narrative. Now here is the detail that will make your jaw drop. Estella Gilbert had an older brother. His name was Dave Gilbert. Dave Gilbert is the brave young man described in Laura's book The Long Winter, the one who made the extraordinary, dangerous run to Lake Preston, Dakota Territory, on a horse-drawn sled, slipping out between blizzards, risking his life to carry the outgoing mail and bring back the incoming mail when the town was completely snowbound. In the books, he is described as a hero. He was 17 years old, travelling alone through blizzard conditions, navigating by memory because the landscape was buried and featureless and deadly. He was a hero. And his sister is the girl who got turned into part of Nellie Olson. In the same series of books, in some of the same chapters, Dave Gilbert's heroism is honoured, and Estella Gilbert's existence is borrowed, renamed, and folded into the villain. That is the frontier, right there. That is how this story actually worked, not the clean separation of good and evil that the books present, but the tangled, complicated reality of people who are neighbours, whose lives overlapped in ways that don't reduce neatly to heroes and villains. Here is what became of them. The real women, not the composite. Nellie Owens married a man named Ernest Kirry and lived to the age of 80. She had a life, a full, complete, 80-year life in which she was not a villain. She was a woman, with a husband and a community, and a story that history did not think worth recording, because someone else had already decided what role she would play. Genevieve Masters, as we said, married and died young, at 41 in Chicago, returned to the soil of Dakota Territory. She had the distinction, if you can call it that, of being the most directly described by Laura as the model for the Nellie we know best. The intellectual rival, the New York snob, the girl who was far nastier than the other one. Estella Gilbert married a man whose last name was Drury. She lived to the age of 80, the same as Nellie Owens. She outlived the books. She may well have read them. Can you imagine? Sitting with these happy golden years in your hands, turning the pages, finding yourself, your buggy rides, your position as the unwanted third wheel, transformed into a scene for Nellie Olson, the fictional villain that half of America had grown up hating. There is no record of whether she ever said anything about it, which is, in its own way, very loud. And here is something scholars have uncovered about all three of these women that the books never hinted at. Something that might make you see the fictional Nellie in a completely different light. The real women were complicated, not in the way that the books suggest, not simply privileged and unpleasant, complicated the way real people are complicated. There was, in the documented histories of these three women's lives, embezzlement. There were lies on census records. There were shady land deals. There were marriages that ended badly. There was a woman widowed twice. There was another who ended up divorced. These were not simple, one-dimensional rich girls floating through a charmed life, looking down at the poor but virtuous Ingalls family. These were women living in the same brutal, uncertain world that Laura was living in. They made hard choices. Some of them made bad choices. They had their own hardships, their own losses, their own moments of desperation that the books never acknowledged because the books were not about them. The books were about Laura. And in a story about Laura, you need a villain, not a neighbour. So Nellie Owens, Genevieve Masters and Estella Gilbert became Nellie Olson. Their complexity was compressed. Their individual stories were erased. Three real women with three real lives became one face, one name, one set of blonde ringlets that millions of readers spent decades loving to hate. None of them were ever asked. Here is where this chapter lands and where it opens into something darker. The composite villain is a literary technique. It is understandable. It is, honestly, effective. Nellie Olson is one of the most memorable characters in American children's literature. Laura and Rose knew what they were doing, but Nellie Olson is the most visible example of a practice that ran through the entire Little House series. The compositing, the erasing, the decision to simplify, to streamline, to make the story cleaner than the truth was. And if they did it to the villain, the character they did not particularly care about honouring accurately, imagine what they did to the people they had stronger reasons to protect. or stronger reasons to erase entirely. Because there is another neighbour we need to talk about. One who does not get even the small dignity of having his story merged with others. One who appears in exactly one chapter out of 8 novels spanning 18 years of Laura's life, and then is never mentioned again. He saved the entire Ingalls family from dying of malaria. He delivered Laura's baby sister into the world. He lived less than a mile from the Ingalls cabin, and his name, in the books, is spelled wrong. That chapter is coming next, and I promise you, it will change the way you read every single one of these books for the rest of your life. Wait. Before we get to that doctor, and we will, I promise that story is coming, let us sit with this Nellie Oleson situation just a little longer, because there is something that did not quite get said, and it matters. When you read the Little House books as a child, you probably did not think of Nellie as a class conflict. You thought of her as a bully, simple. She was mean. Laura was good. The end. But go back and read the actual words in On the Banks of Plum Creek, the 1937 novel where Nellie first appears. The way Nellie is described, her fine clothes, her store-bought ribbons, her beautiful home with real furniture, is written from Laura's perspective. And Laura's perspective at that point in her life was the perspective of a girl who was acutely, painfully aware that her family had less than others. Her dresses were homemade, her shoes were worn. The china shepherdess that rode across states on the wagon shelf was one of the few genuinely beautiful objects the family owned. Nellie Owens, the daughter of the storekeeper, had fine things, and she made sure Laura knew it. That dynamic, the poor girl versus the prosperous girl, the frontier family versus the town merchant's daughter, was real. Census records and land claim documents confirm that the Owens family was in a more stable financial position than the Ingalls family during their Walnut Grove years. The real Nellie Owens really did have more. And the real Laura Ingalls really did feel the sting of that difference every single day she walked into that schoolroom. But here is what the books never say out loud. The Ingalls family was not simply unlucky. They were poor in part because Charles Ingalls could not stop moving. While merchant families like the Owens family built businesses, built inventory, built community roots, Charles was packing up wagons and searching for something better just over the next horizon. The Nellie figures in Laura's life were partly a reminder of what staying in one place could build and what perpetual moving cost. Laura, writing in her 60s, made the class conflict into a character flaw. Nellie is mean. Nellie is snobbish. Nellie is wrong. And Laura, the poor girl, is virtuous. But the real Nellie Owens was 8 years old. She was a child born into her family's relative prosperity, exactly as Laura was born into her family's relative poverty. She had no more chosen her comfortable life than Laura had chosen her difficult one. She was not a villain. She was a kid who had more than the new girl and probably knew it. She lived to 80. The real Nellie Owens grew old and died and presumably never imagined that her childhood behaviour in a Minnesota schoolroom would be read about by 60 million people around the world. Her descendants are out there, her grandchildren, her great-grandchildren, living among us. They have a grandmother who got turned into one of the most famous literary villains in American children's literature. And the name Nellie Oleson on the character was close enough to Nellie Owens that anyone in Walnut Grove who remembered the Owens family would have known exactly who inspired it. Whether the real Nellie ever found out, whether she read the books, whether someone told her, whether she recognised her father's store and her brother Willie's unchanged name and understood what had happened, there is no surviving record of her reaction. That silence belongs to her. There is one more thing about Genevieve Masters that deserves to be said clearly, because it matters to the story, and it has been overlooked. Laura's original Pioneer Girl manuscript describes the social dynamics of that Walnut Grove schoolroom with considerably more complexity than the published books. In Pioneer Girl, there were not simply 2 groups, Laura's friends and Nellie's friends. There were 3 factions. Nellie Owens had her following among the girls who liked the mercantile goods her father sold and the candy she could offer. Genevieve Masters had her following among the girls who were impressed by her New York airs and her fashionable clothes. And then there was Laura, who, by her own account in that manuscript, refused to be led by either of them. What Laura describes, if you read closely, is not a simple hero versus villain story. It is a story about a girl who was stubborn enough and self-possessed enough to stand apart from both social factions, to play Nellie and Genevieve off against each other, and to end up as the unexpected social centre, because both of the other girls wanted her on their side. That Laura, the strategically stubborn, socially perceptive Laura, does not quite appear in the published books. In the books, Nellie is the antagonist and Laura is the plucky underdog. The three-way social complexity is flattened into a two-sided fight that is easier to follow and more emotionally satisfying. But the real Laura, at 7 and 8 years old, was already doing something remarkable. She was navigating a complicated social landscape with a kind of clear-eyed pragmatism that the books, by simplifying it, actually undersell. And Genevieve Masters, the far nastier of the two Walnut Grove girls, the New York girl who sneered at Westerners and lisped when she spoke and snivelled when she did not get her way, was real enough and nasty enough that Laura remembered her with extraordinary precision 60 years later. She lisped. Laura specifically remembered the lisp after 60 years. That is how much Genevieve Masters got under her skin. Now think about this final detail before we move on. Nellie Olson appears in 3 of the 8 Little House novels: On the Banks of Plum Creek in 1937, Little Town on the Prairie in 1941, and These Happy Golden Years in 1943. She spans, in fictional terms, roughly 8 years of Laura's life, from childhood into young adulthood. She's there for the mud puddle incident, for the classroom rivalries, for the buggy rides, for the social sparring of a small prairie town. She feels like one continuous person. But she was Nellie Owens when Laura was 7. She was Genevieve Masters when Laura was 9, and again in her early teens. And she was Estella Gilbert when Laura was courting Almanzo. 3 different people, 3 different ages of Laura's life, 3 different emotional textures to the conflict, compressed into one face, one name, one persistent presence across an impossible geographic continuity. It is brilliant as literature, and it is dishonest as history. Both things are true, and understanding that both things are true is, I would argue, the only honest way to read these books. Now, there is a man we need to talk about, a man who lived less than a mile from the Ingalls cabin in Kansas in 1870, a man who walked through the door of that cabin when the entire family, Pa, Ma, Mary, baby Carrie, and 4-year-old Laura, was lying deathly ill with malaria, burning with fever, barely conscious, too sick to call for help. He brought quinine. He came back until they were well. He delivered Carrie Ingalls into the world on August 3rd, 1870. He practiced medicine in that community for decades, serving both white settlers and Osage peoples without asking about a patient's race or ability to pay. In 8 novels covering 18 years of Laura's life, he appears in exactly 1 chapter. His name is spelled wrong. And the chapter never mentions that he lived next door. That is the next part of this story, and it is the part that should make every reader, every single one of us who grew up loving these books, stop and ask a very serious question about whose lives were allowed to matter in the story America chose to tell about itself. Summer, 1870, Kansas. The Ingalls family has been living on the Osage Diminished Reserve in Montgomery County for nearly a year. It is brutally hot. The creek bottoms near their cabin, the low marshy ground where the water sits still in the heat, are thick with mosquitoes. Not the kind you wave away at a summer picnic. The kind that swarm in clouds, that crawl into your ears and your nose, that leave a child's face speckled with bites by morning. And nobody in 1870 knew what caused malaria. They called it fever and ague. They thought it came from bad air rising out of swamps, or from rotten melons, or from some mysterious poison in the soil. They had no idea it was carried by the female Anopheles mosquito, no idea that a microscopic parasite called Plasmodium was passing from insect to bloodstream to fever to death. What they knew was this: when it hit a frontier family, it could kill everyone in the cabin. The first one to wake with it was Laura. She said later that she felt cold in the hot sunshine and could not get warm no matter how close she stood to the fire. Then Mary, then Pa, then Ma, then baby Carrie, who was barely a month old. Within days, the entire Ingalls family, every single one of them, was lying flat, burning with fever, racked with chills, or else slipping in and out of delirium in a dark cabin on the Kansas prairie. Pa was too sick to ride to Independence, 13 miles away, to fetch a doctor. Ma was too sick to care for the children, and the children were too sick to care for themselves. They were dying, and a man who lived less than a mile away walked through their door and saved their lives. His name was George A. Tann. He was a black doctor, a Civil War veteran, a homesteader, and a physician serving both white settlers and Osage people without distinction of race or ability to pay. He brought quinine, of the standard treatment for malaria at the time, and he came back to that cabin again and again until every member of the Ingalls family had recovered. He also delivered baby Carrie Ingalls on August 3, 1870. The birth certificate lists him as the attending physician. The Ingalls family Bible records the birth date. The 1870 federal census, taken just 9 days later on August 12th and 13th, places the Ingalls family in Rutland Township, Montgomery County, Kansas, the same township where George Tann lived and practiced. Without him, there almost certainly would have been no Ingalls family to write about, and in 8 novels covering 18 years of Laura's life, he appears in exactly 1 chapter. His name is spelled wrong. Let us back up. Let us talk about who George Tann actually was, because he deserves more than a footnote in someone else's story. George A. Tann was born in Pennsylvania, free, which was remarkable for a black man in antebellum America. When the Civil War came, he served. He served in the Union Army, giving something enormous to a country that had not yet decided whether people who looked like him deserved to be considered full human beings. When the war ended, he went west. Kansas was drawing black settlers, thousands of them, with promises of opportunity that the burned and blood-soaked soil of the post-war South could not offer. By 1870, approximately 17,000 black men and women called Kansas home. They were homesteaders, farmers, merchants, ministers, teachers. They were building communities. They were trying, with whatever tools the law gave them, to claim the promise that the war had supposedly been fought to deliver. George Tann filed a homestead claim on 160 acres in Rutland Township, Montgomery County, Kansas. He practiced medicine, eclectic medicine, they called it, a combination of botanical remedies and physical treatment that he had likely learned through apprenticeship, since formal medical schools in that era routinely denied admission to black applicants. He was, by historical accounts, particularly skilled at setting bones. He treated whoever came to him, regardless of race, regardless of whether they could pay. He was known for compassion and what one historical account describes as honesty, meaning he would tell you the truth about your condition whether or not it was what you wanted to hear. He was, in the plainest possible terms, one of the most important men in that community. And the Ingalls family knew it. Here is what the books say about him. Chapter 15 of The Little House on the Prairie, the novel published in 1935, is titled Fever and Egg. In it, the family falls ill, the dog Jack somehow summons a passing doctor, and a man described as a black doctor appears, treats the family with quinine, and the chapter ends with Pa recovering enough to make Ma a rocking chair out of willow saplings so she can rest comfortably. That is it. The chapter is warm. It is told with gratitude. Laura does not minimize what he did. She remembers the medicine, the care, the fact that he saved them, but the chapter ends, and he is gone. In the next chapter, the family is recovering. The doctor does not appear again in that book. He does not appear in any of the 7 novels that follow. He is not mentioned when Carrie Ingalls is born, because in the books Carrie was already born before the malaria struck. The timeline was adjusted, and the birth, and the doctor who attended it became invisible. His name in the book is spelled Dr. Tann, 1 N, not 2. George A. Tann, 2 N's, a real man, a documented neighbour, a person whose homestead claim in Rutland Township places him within a mile of the Ingalls cabin, is spelled with 1 N, as though someone was not entirely sure he deserved the effort of a second letter. His grave in the Mount Hope Cemetery in Independence, Kansas, carries an inscription that reads, "A Negro who doctored the Ingalls for malaria in 1870. That is how history remembered him. through a grave marker in someone else's yard. Now, here is the part that should stop you cold. The books never acknowledge that Dr. Tann was a neighbour. In Little House on the Prairie, he is presented as a passing stranger, someone the dog stopped on the road, someone who happened to be going in the right direction and happened to know how to treat malaria. He appears, he helps, he continues on his way. A kind stranger, a fortunate coincidence. But he was not a stranger. He lived less than a mile away. He was one of the Ingalls family's closest neighbours on the reserve. He knew them. He treated them repeatedly over the period they lived in Kansas. He was there when the most intimate and vulnerable moment a family can experience, the birth of a child, required a physician's presence and skill. The decision to present him as a passing stranger, rather than a known neighbour, was a choice, made by Laura, shaped perhaps by Rose, approved by publishers, endorsed by the story they were telling, a story in which the Ingalls family moved through a wilderness that was essentially empty, except for their own white nuclear family and the occasional dramatic encounter with wild nature or hostile Indians. A black doctor neighbour who saved them from malaria and delivered their baby did not fit that story, so he was compressed into one chapter. He was given one N instead of two. He was rendered a stranger, and then he was let go, never to appear again. Consider what was stripped from the historical record by this choice. In the 1870s and 1880s, the frontier was not the white wilderness that the books suggest. Kansas alone had 17,000 black residents by 1870. Many of them were homesteaders, working the same land claims, dealing with the same brutal weather, facing the same crop failures. The exoduster movement of the late 1870s and 1880s would bring even more, formerly enslaved people pouring into Kansas from the deep south, seeking the land and freedom that had been promised them after the Civil War. Dr. Tann was part of this world. He served it. He moved, in the later part of his career, to the Cherokee Nation in what is now Oklahoma, continuing to practice medicine in Indian Territory. He married a second time after separating from his first wife. He had daughters. He worked. He built a life of genuine substance in a country that was actively working against men who looked like him. He retired from practice in 1902. He had been a physician for more than 30 years, and in 1909, on a day that must have seemed completely ordinary, his horse broke free of its traces and bolted. George Tann ran after it, and somewhere between the barn and the fence line his heart gave out. He fell at his own farm gate. He died on a March day in 1909 at approximately 73 years of age, still working his land, still farming, still living the life he had claimed under the Homestead Act decades before. He was buried in Independence, Kansas. His story was largely forgotten outside of Wilder scholarship, until researchers comparing census records and birth certificates and the annotated Pioneer Girl manuscript put the pieces together and traced his name back to that one chapter, that one misspelled word. The Pioneer Girl Project, connected to the South Dakota State Historical Society Press, has done crucial work in documenting Dr. Tann's life and legacy. And when researchers traced his descendants, when they walked through the Mount Hope Cemetery and found his grave, when they read that inscription, a Negro who doctored the Ingalls for malaria in 1870, they were standing in front of proof that a man's entire extraordinary life had been reduced, in the public memory, to his connection to a white family's children's book. That is worth being angry about. Even if you love the books, maybe especially then. There is one more layer here that makes this worse, or more complicated, or both. The 1930s, when Laura was writing and Rose was editing, were not a neutral time for race in America. They were a time of extraordinary racial violence, of active and legally enforced segregation, of a mainstream white American culture that was deeply and structurally invested in not seeing black contributions to American life. Writing a black doctor as a prominent recurring figure in a children's book series, giving him a name, a backstory, a relationship with the family, a presence across multiple volumes, would have been a choice that required courage and commitment. A choice to say, this man matters. This man's presence in our story is real and important, and you, the reader, are going to know it. That choice was not made. What was made instead was the safer choice, the one-chapter choice, the passing stranger choice, the Dr. Tann choice, with the single N, as though even his name was too heavy to carry in full. And perhaps the saddest detail of all, the one that lodges itself and will not come out, is this. Laura was 4 years old when Dr. Tann treated her family. She was 3 when she arrived in Kansas. Her memories of that entire period were fragmented, partial, reconstructed from a combination of personal recollection and stories told to her later by her parents. She may genuinely not have known, as a child, how close Dr. Tann lived. She may genuinely not have grasped, in her feverish 3-year-old state, who the man was who kept appearing at their door with medicine. Children see the surface of things, the kind face, the brown hands holding a cup, the relief on Ma's face when the doctor arrived. But she was 63 when she wrote Pioneer Girl, and 68 when Little House on the Prairie was published. By then, she had grown up. By then, she knew. By then, she had written about a black doctor who delivered her sister and saved her family. And she had chosen what to do with that story. She chose one chapter, one N, one passing stranger, and then she moved on. George Tann's grave still stands in Independence, Kansas. If you visit, you will find the inscription. You will find the stone that names him in relationship to a family he outlived in historical memory. Remembered not for his 30 years of medicine, not for his Civil War service, not for his homestead or his daughters, or his death at his own farm gate on a March morning in 1909. Remembered for 16 months on a Kansas prairie, in a cabin full of sick white settlers who needed him and took what he gave and then, for 80 years, forgot to mention that he lived next door. History has been slowly correcting that. This is part of the correction. Now, there is a third neighbour to meet, a man whose very name was changed between Laura's original manuscript and the published book. A man described in those books as the beloved wild cat from Tennessee. Loyal, friendly, the kind of frontier companion who would swim a flooded creek in December to bring Christmas gifts to 2 little girls. His name in the Pioneer Girl manuscript was not Edwards, it was Brown. And the man who actually helped build that cabin in Kansas was not from Tennessee at all. He was from England. His name was Edmund Mason. And he is buried a mile down the road from the Little House site, in a cemetery that most tourists drive right past on their way to see the famous log cabin replica. That story is next. There is a cemetery in Montgomery County, Kansas, all called Harrison Cemetery. It sits along a dirt road near the site of the original Ingalls homestead, the place where the famous Little House on the Prairie once stood. Most tourists who visit the area drive right past it. They are heading to the replica cabin, the little museum, the gift shop. They are looking for Laura. They are not looking for the man in that cemetery, but they should be. His name was Edmund Mason. He was born in England approximately in 1845, and by the time the 1870 federal census was taken in Rutland Township, Montgomery County, Kansas, he was 25 years old, unmarried, and living on a homestead not far from the Ingalls claim. He helped Charles Ingalls build his log cabin. He almost certainly helped in other ways too. Frontier neighbours did. That was the rule of life on the prairie. You helped because someday you would need help. He's buried in Harrison Cemetery. His grave is there. His stone is there. And in 8 novels read by 60 million people, he's called Mr. Edwards, born in Tennessee, described as the wild cat from Tennessee, and written as one of the most beloved recurring characters in American children's literature. His actual name was Edmund Mason. He was English. And in the original manuscript Laura wrote in 1930, he was not called Edwards at all. He was called Mr. Brown. Let us go back to where the story starts, to the original Pioneer Girl manuscript. Laura sat down in 1930 and wrote, from memory, the story of her childhood when she got to the chapter about Kansas, about the helpful bachelor neighbour who assisted Pa with the cabin, who crossed a flooded creek to bring Christmas presents for the girls. She called him Mr. Brown, not Mr. Edwards, Mr. Brown. This matters because there is, in the 1870 federal census for Rutland Township, Montgomery County, Kansas, a man named Fred Brown. He was 35 years old, born in Alabama, a bachelor, and living in the same township as the Ingalls family. Alabama is not Tennessee, but it is the South, and the South is considerably closer in character to the romanticized Tennessee wildcat description than England ever could be. So we have two candidates, Edmund Mason, the Englishman buried near the Little House site whose grave researchers discovered, and Fred Brown, the Alabama bachelor whose name matches Laura's original Mr. Brown in the manuscript. Scholars have argued this question for decades and have not definitively resolved it. What we know for certain is that the man in the books, the wildcat from Tennessee, named Mr. Edwards, was almost certainly neither of them. He was a construction, a composite built from memory and editorial choice, and the recognition that Tennessee sounds dramatically more American frontier than England or Alabama. Between 1930 and 1935, when Little House on the Prairie was published, Mr. Brown became Mr. Edwards. His origin moved from wherever it originally was to Tennessee. His character was sharpened, warmed, given that evocative nickname that makes him feel like a man right out of a Davy Crockett story. And then, in the subsequent novels, he kept reappearing, showing up in Dakota Territory years later, hundreds of miles from Kansas, as though the Prairie were a small neighborhood where a man might reasonably run into his old neighbors just by chance, the Christmas chapter. That is where this hits hardest. You know the Christmas story. Every person who has ever read these books knows the Christmas story. It is one of the most beloved chapters in all of American children's literature. Christmas Day and the flooded creek between Independence and the Ingalls claim means that Mr. Edwards cannot bring the girls their presents. The water is too high, too fast, too cold. Mary and Laura have been told not to expect anything this year. There will be no candy, no gifts from Santa Claus, because the creek will not be crossed. And then Mr. Edwards shows up at the door, soaking wet, grinning. He swam it. He swam the flooded creek in December to bring Mary and Laura each a tin cup, a piece of heart-shaped cake, a stick of candy, and a shining new penny. Laura wrote decades later that she could still taste that candy, that it was the best Christmas she ever had. This incident almost certainly happened. Something like it. With someone like him. The emotional truth of it. The kindness of a lonely bachelor neighbour who wanted two little girls to have a Christmas rings too specific and too vivid to be pure invention. But the man in the story is not the man who actually helped. The man in the story is assembled from the rough materials of frontier memory. A real act of kindness, a real neighbour's name changed, a fictional origin added, a romantic nickname applied, to create a character who could carry the emotional weight of the story across multiple books and multiple years. Edmund Mason, if he was the Christmas man, never crossed a flooded creek in the pages of a book that bore his real name. He crossed it as someone else. He's buried a mile down the road from the famous cabin, and the tourists drive past him every year on their way to see Laura. And here is the part that the books truly cannot account for, because it contradicts the deepest premise of the Mr. Edwards story. He keeps coming back. In By the Shores of Silver Lake, published in 1939, Mr. Edwards appears in Dakota Territory to help Pa file a land claim during the Great Rush of 1879 settlers. Then he gives $20, a significant sum, to help send Mary Ingalls to the Iowa College for the Blind in Vinton, Iowa. He is warm, he is loyal, he is exactly the same man he was in Kansas a decade earlier, but the Ingalls left Kansas in 1870. Edmund Mason, or Fred Brown, or whoever actually helped them in that cabin, almost certainly never saw the Ingalls family again after that. Frontier people moved. They lost track of each other. Letters sometimes crossed the distance, but often did not. The idea of a bachelor neighbour from Montgomery County, Kansas, spontaneously appearing in Kingsbury County, Dakota Territory 9 years later, having tracked down the same family across hundreds of miles of prairie, is not impossible. It is just not very likely. What is more likely is that different men in different places helped the Ingalls family in different ways. A man who helped Pa file a land claim in De Smet. A man who contributed money when Mary needed school funding. Acts of community generosity that were common on the frontier, because frontier survival required communities, not isolated nuclear families, and that were attributed for narrative simplicity to one beloved recurring character. The problem is that in attributing it all to one man, the books made a very specific argument. that the Ingalls family had one special loyal friend who showed up across decades and geographies, driven by individual devotion. When the reality was something more collective and therefore more profound, they had communities, neighbours who helped not out of personal loyalty to one specific family, but because that was the understood compact of frontier life. You helped. Someone helped you. The circle held. Everyone survived. That truth, the communal truth, is actually more beautiful than the individual hero version. It says something important about how human beings managed to survive hard places and hard times, but it did not serve the libertarian story that Rose Wilder Lane needed the books to tell. So Mr. Edwards stayed. Warm, beloved, impossibly loyal Mr. Edwards. The wildcat from Tennessee who never was. There is one final detail in the Mr. Edwards mystery that scholars have been quietly turning over for years. The excavation of the Little House site in Kansas has confirmed some of the physical details Laura described. The well, for instance. Parr's account of digging the well, the measurements, the near accident when toxic gas almost killed him. All of that matches the archaeological evidence of an actual well in the right location. The physical world of these books is, in many ways, precisely accurate. But the people are not. And that is the interesting dividing line. Laura remembered places with extraordinary precision. She remembered distances, dimensions, the look of a landscape, the sound of wind through particular grass. She remembered the way the light fell on a creek bottom in summer. These things she carried in her body, in her senses, in the way a child encodes the world before language has fully arrived. She remembered people the way memory always remembers people, imprecisely, incompletely, filtered through feeling rather than fact. Genevieve Masters' lisp, 60 years later. The weight of Dr. Tann's kindness, remembered vaguely by a feverish 3-year-old. The shape of a bachelor neighbour's goodwill at Christmas, attached to a name that may not even have been his name. This is not a condemnation of Laura. This is how human memory works. What it is a warning about the books. They are one woman's memory, shaped by her daughter's politics, packaged for a children's market, and sold to 60 million readers as the story of the American frontier. The landscape is real. The love is real. The hardship is real. The neighbours are something more complicated. Now we need to talk about the one man the books shaped more carefully than any other. Not because he was a stranger, because he was family. Pa, the man who moved them 14 times. The man who may have ridden with vigilantes on a dark Kansas night and come home saying the Benders would never be found. The man whose fiddle played, and whose stories charmed, and whose wanderlust cost his family more than the books have ever been willing to say. That chapter is coming right now. Let us talk about Charles Ingalls, not the Pa of the books, the real one. The books give us a man who is, in the plainest possible terms, too good to be entirely true. He is patient. He is wise. He is talented at everything the frontier requires. Building, hunting, farming, playing music, telling stories by firelight. He makes decisions thoughtfully, adapts to hardship gracefully, provides for his family under conditions that would break lesser men, and always, nor always finds a way to make the best of whatever the land and the weather and the economy have decided to throw at him this particular season. He is the father that every daughter wants to remember having, and he was real. That is the complicated part. Charles Philip Ingalls, born February 10th, 1836 in Cuba, New York, was genuinely loving. He genuinely played the fiddle beautifully. He genuinely told wonderful stories. He genuinely adored his daughters. By all accounts, emotional warmth was not something he had to perform. It was simply who he was. But the books leave out the part where love is not enough. Charles Ingalls moved his family at least 14 times in roughly 20 years. He settled on land he had no legal right to occupy. He tried ventures that failed. He ran up debts he could not pay. Then he chased opportunities that dissolved in his hands like morning frost the moment he reached for them. And he died in 1902 in De Smet, South Dakota, at the age of 65. Not wealthy, not settled, not the patriarch of a flourishing frontier dynasty. He died in the town he had last landed in a house his daughters helped pay for. That is the real ending of Pa's story. Consider the moves, all 14 of them, or as close to 14 as we can track. Wisconsin, where they started. Missouri, briefly, in 1869, a stop that left so little impression it barely appears in any record. Then Kansas, the famous Kansas of the Little House books, where they squatted illegally on Osage land and built the log cabin and met Mr. Brown, who became Mr. Edwards, and Dr. Tann, who appeared in one chapter. Then back to Wisconsin, when the government threatened to evict settlers from the Osage Reserve. Then Minnesota, Walnut Grove, Plum Creek. The books cover this period in On the Banks of Plum Creek. The grasshoppers that destroyed the crops, the brutal winters, the slow grind of prairie farming. But the books do not tell you that by 1876, the Ingalls family was so financially depleted that Charles accepted an offer to help manage a hotel in Burr Oak, Iowa. Burr Oak, Iowa. You will notice that name does not appear in any of the 8 Little House novels. There are 8 books covering roughly 18 years of Laura's childhood and young adulthood. The Iowa period, approximately a year, from 1876 to 1877, is missing. Gone. Erased with a thoroughness that suggests conscious choice rather than simple oversight. Here is why. In Burr Oak, the Ingalls family was not homesteading. They were not proving up a land claim or breaking sod or living the rugged pioneer dream. They were working for other people in a hotel called the Masters Hotel, named, in a darkly ironic twist, for the family whose daughter Genevieve would later become one of the 3 women folded into Nellie Oleson. Charles was running the establishment. The family lived upstairs. They were employees. For a man whose entire identity was built around the idea of independence, of land ownership, of making his own way on his own terms, working in a hotel was a kind of defeat. And the hotel itself was not a pleasant place. Laura, who was 9 years old during the Burr Oak period, later told a 1937 audience that she had witnessed things there that she could not put in a children's book. That Ian set himself on fire after drinking too much. He died of his burns. Laura saw the aftermath. There was domestic violence. There were drunken scenes that no child should witness. The hotel attracted the rough and sometimes desperate edge of frontier life, and Laura's bedroom was directly above it. None of this appears in the published books. Ma and Pa's infant son, born in 1875 who died in infancy, also does not appear in the books. His brief life is entirely omitted. In a world where infant death was common and devastating, the Ingalls family experienced it too. Laura knew what it was to lose a sibling. She simply chose not to write it for children. The choice is understandable. Some of it is even generous. Protecting her father's legacy, protecting young readers from grief that the story did not require them to carry. But the cumulative effect of all these choices was a Pa who never failed, a family that never broke, a pioneer life that never touched the ugliest truths about what the frontier actually was. The Burr Oak period ended, and they moved. Back to Walnut Grove briefly, then to Dakota Territory, De Smet, Kingsbury County, in 1879. Charles took a job working for the railroad first, surveying and managing the surveyor's house while the railroad crews laid track across the plains. Eventually he filed a homestead claim. He built a building in town that the family lived in during the first hard winter, and here is where the books are at their most accurate and their most selective simultaneously. The hard winter of 1880 to 1881 is covered in The Long Winter, published in 1940. It is considered one of the strongest books in the series. The blizzards that came one after another from October through April, cutting De Smet off from the supply trains, reducing the town to near starvation, the famous journey of Cap Garland and Almanzo Wilder to find a settler's hidden wheat cache south of town. It is a gripping, terrifying, beautiful piece of writing about what community survival actually looks like when death is a blizzard away, and it is largely accurate. Cap Garland, whose real name was Oscar Edward Garland, known as Cap, was real. He was a teenager at the time, probably 16 or 17, and he and Almanzo Wilder made that extraordinary journey by horse sled across a frozen, featureless landscape to bring back seed wheat so that the town would not starve. Cap Garland's heroism is one of the few genuinely unembellished stories in the entire series. He was real, he was brave, and he died tragically young, in August of 1891, at approximately 27 years of age, when the boiler of a steam threshing machine exploded, throwing him 30 feet into the air. His legs were shattered. He died of his injuries. He was 27. The books honour him. The books do not tell you how he died, because that happened after the period the books cover, but the courage they attribute to him was real courage. The books do not, however, quite explain where the wheat came from philosophically. Almanzo and Cap risked their lives to find it. A settler named Anderson had it, and he wanted to keep it, wanted to hold on to his seed supply for the following season's planting. The negotiation was tense. In the end, he sold it. The community survived because 2 teenagers risked their lives in a blizzard, because a third man was willing to sell his seed wheat, and because the whole fragile network of interdependence that was frontier society functioned the way it was supposed to. Not because one nuclear family survived on their own virtue. Now. There is a story about Pa that Laura told exactly once, in public, at a book fair in 1937. She told it to a room full of fans and booksellers and admirers, and then, as far as we can tell, she never spoke of it again. It is about the Benders, the Bender family. We will cover them in full in the next chapter, because they deserve it. We're a family of 4 who operated a roadside inn between the Ingalls homestead and Independence, Kansas, in the early 1870s. Pa stopped at the Bender Inn multiple times for water when driving the wagon into town. Laura, small and uncomprehending, sat in the wagon and once saw Kate Bender in the doorway. In May of 1873, bodies began surfacing in the Bender garden. At least 10 confirmed victims, travellers who had stopped at the inn for a meal or lodging and never continued their journey. They had been murdered and buried beneath the freshly turned soil of what had appeared to be a kitchen garden. The Bender family had fled by the time investigators arrived. Now here is what Laura told that 1937 audience. She said that after the bodies were discovered, after the horrified community understood what had been happening at that roadside inn, her father rode out with a group of men, a posse, a group that was not exactly law enforcement, not exactly a vigilante mob, but something in between. The kind of extra-legal justice that frontier communities sometimes assembled when they were angry enough and frightened enough, and the law was far enough away. He came home late, and when Ma asked where the Benders were, whether they had been found, Pa said, in what Laura described as a strange tone, that the Benders would never be found. They were never found. Now. Scholars are careful about this story, and rightly so. There are timeline problems. The Ingalls family left Kansas in 1870. The Benders' crimes were discovered in May of 1873, 3 years later. Could Charles have ridden back for the manhunt? Could he have heard the news later in Wisconsin and returned? Could Laura's memory, had recorded almost 65 years after the events, have blurred or compressed the timeline? Yes. All of those things are possible. Laura was old when she told that story, and memory is not a recording device, but she told it. She was specific about the strange tone in his voice. She was specific about the fact that the Benders were, in fact, never found. She told it in public, and then she never put it in the books. If Pa rode with vigilantes, if he participated in extra-legal frontier justice on a dark Kansas night, that would have been the end of the beloved, gentle, fiddle-playing father of the books. It would have been honest. It would have been complicated. It would have been real. It would not have been suitable for children. So it stayed in a single 1937 speech, and Pa remained perfect. Caroline Ingalls deserves a paragraph here. She has been largely invisible in this story, and that invisibility is itself historical. Ma, born Caroline Lake Quiner in 1839 in Brookfield, Waukesha County, Wisconsin, was educated, refined, and deeply committed to maintaining the standards of civilization she had grown up with. She insisted her children have manners, proper grammar, clean hands at the table. She read to them. She maintained a household that was orderly and dignified through conditions that would have broken most people. She was, by every account and by the evidence of her daughter's testimony, a remarkable woman. She also had no legal say in any of the 14 moves. Under the laws of the 1860s, 1870s, and 1880s, a married woman's property was her husband's property. Her choices were her husband's choices. If Charles said they were going to Kansas, they went to Kansas. If he said Burr Oak, they went to Burr Oak. If he said Dakota Territory, they packed the wagon. Laura, writing decades later, presents Ma's attitude toward these moves as quiet, dignified acceptance, sometimes with a note of sadness, sometimes with visible reluctance, but always ultimately supportive. Whether this accurately represents how Caroline felt, or whether it represents what Laura needed to believe about her mother's feelings in order to tell a coherent story about her father, is impossible to say from the outside. Caroline left no diary. She left very few letters. Her inner life is almost entirely unknown to us. What we know is that she outlived her husband by 22 years. She died in 1924 at the age of 84, having outlived not only Charles but her daughter Mary as well. She spent her last decades in De Smet, living with her daughters, in the same town she'd landed in when Charles stopped moving. There is no record of whether she was glad the moving finally stopped, and here is the inheritance that Pa left his eldest surviving daughter. Laura Ingalls, who watched her father pack the wagon 14 times, who understood in her bones the cost of his restlessness, who saw the pattern from childhood and recognised it again when Almanzo Wilder started talking about moving after their own early years of failed farming and disaster in Dakota Territory. Laura put her foot down. They stayed in Mansfield, Missouri. They built Rocky Ridge Farm together, slowly, painstakingly over decades. They stayed. They improved the land. They accumulated. They did what Charles Ingalls had spent his life being unable to do. And then, in her 60s, Laura sat down and wrote her father as nearly perfect. She gave him wisdom. She gave him patience. She gave him judgment. She gave him all the qualities that would have made the family's life easier, steadier, more grounded. And she gave them to him in the form of the man he was at his best, in his warmest moments, on his most loving evenings with his fiddle and his stories, and his daughters around him in lamplight. That act of love, the deliberate choice to honour the best of him while letting the worst of him slip quietly out of the narrative, is one of the most human things about these books. We all do it. We remember the people we love through the best version of who they were, not the most complete version. The difference is that Laura published it, and 60 million people read it and believed it was history. Charles Ingalls is buried in the De Smet cemetery alongside his wife, his daughter Mary, and his infant son, the one the books never mention. They're all there together, on a piece of ground in South Dakota, under stones that mark the end of all that moving. He was 65. He had never quite achieved what he was always certain was just ahead. He had loved his family extravagantly and served them imperfectly. He had played beautiful music and made terrible financial decisions. He had told stories that kept his daughters warm on nights when there was not enough fuel for the stove, and he had moved them, again and again, away from the warmth they had already built. He was human. Fully, completely, irreducibly human. And the books made him into something slightly better than that, which is in the end both their great gift and their great lie. Now. There is a piece of land we need to talk about, the land the little house sits on, the land that was not the Ingalls family's to claim, and the people who were taken off it, so that people like the Ingalls family could try. Let us go back to the beginning, the very beginning of the Little House story. Fall, 1869. Charles Ingalls loads his family into a covered wagon and drives south and west from Wisconsin into the prairie country of southeastern Kansas. He has heard that land is opening up there. He has heard the frontier calling in the particular register that it always called to him, the suggestion of something better, something more, just a little further on. He's not wrong that there is land. He is wrong about almost everything else. The land he settles on, the land where he builds the log cabin, digs the well, plants the garden, names the creek, and raises the girls whose story became a beloved piece of American literature, is the Osage Diminished Reserve. A 50-mile-wide strip of southeastern Kansas established by federal treaty in 1865, protected, in the most explicit legal language available, from white settlement. The Ingalls family is squatting, illegally, on land that does not belong to them, on land that the United States government has formally in writing promised to the Osage Nation. And they are not the only ones. Thousands of white settlers poured into the Osage Reserve in the late 1860s, confident, correctly as it turned out, that the government would eventually open the land to settlement rather than honour its treaty obligations to the Osage. It was a pattern that had been repeated across the continent for 200 years. Promise, violation, dispossession, forgetting. The books handle this in a way that is interesting to examine closely, because it is neither complete dishonesty nor complete honesty. In Little House on the Prairie, the Osage are present. They are not erased, not entirely. Laura describes them moving through the area in large groups, the men riding, the women following with loaded horses and dogs. The columns of travellers that seem to go on and on past the cabin door. She describes the fear she felt as a child. She describes Ma's terror, Mary's stillness. She describes Pa's response to that fear, which was, notably for a white settler in 1870, considerably more nuanced than most of his neighbours. In the books, a neighbour named Mrs. Scott says, "The only good Indian is a dead Indian," and Pa responds flatly that this is not true. It is one of the more remarkable moments in the series. A white male protagonist in a children's book from 1935 explicitly rejecting one of the ugliest clichés of American frontier racism. Pa also expresses genuine respect for Soldat Duchesne, the Osage leader whose name translates roughly as Soldier of the Oak, a man who, in the books, walks with the dignity of someone who understands exactly what is happening and is trying to navigate it with as much grace as possible. Pa calls him a great man. He means it. This is worth acknowledging. Relative to almost every other frontier narrative of the era, the Little House books are more sympathetic to indigenous peoples than the cultural norm demanded or even expected. Laura remembered real encounters. She preserved real moments of recognition across the settler-indigenous divide. But she never once acknowledged that the Ingalls family was on that land illegally. She never acknowledged that the Osage were not an ominous presence moving through someone else's prairie. They were the owners of the land. They were watching squatters build cabins on their legally protected territory and calculating how long before the government, as it always did, sided with the white settlers over the treaty. The answer, as it turned out, was 3 years. By 1873, the Osage had been forced entirely from Kansas into Indian Territory, in what is now Oklahoma, onto land that had been purchased, under considerable pressure, from the Cherokee Nation. They left behind the graves of their ancestors, the trails of their migrations, the seasonal camps they had used for generations. They left behind the strip of Kansas that 4 separate federal treaties had promised them. They left behind the plot of land where the Ingalls family built a cabin, a well, and a story that 60 million people would eventually read without knowing any of this. The Osage Nation still exists. They are not a people of the past. They are a nation based in Pawhuska, Oklahoma, and they have been vocal in recent decades about the way the Little House books have shaped public understanding, or rather public misunderstanding, of what happened in Kansas in the 1860s and 1870s. In 2018, the American Library Association removed Laura Ingalls Wilder's name from a major children's literature award, renaming the Laura Ingalls Wilder Medal the Children's Literature Legacy Award, citing the book's portrayal of indigenous peoples and African Americans. The decision was controversial. Many readers defended the books passionately. Others argued that context was enough, that you could love the books while acknowledging their racial blind spots. The Osage Nation's position is worth understanding on its own terms. These are not abstract academic complaints about a historical text. They are the objections of a people who watch their forced displacement from their own legally protected land rendered, in one of America's most widely read book series, as a natural and inevitable backdrop to a white family's story of courage and self-sufficiency. The Osage were not backdrop. They were people. They had a sophisticated government, a complex culture, an economy based on agriculture and trade that had sustained them across the plains for generations before a single covered wagon crossed the Missouri River. The books never told you that. Now we need to talk about the Benders. This is the story that Laura kept out of the books because she said it was not suitable for children. She was right about that. It is not suitable for children, but you are not a child and it happened. And it is part of the real landscape of the Kansas prairie that the Little House books made famous. The Bender family, John Bender, his wife, known as Ma Bender, their son John Jr., and their daughter Kate, arrived in Labette County, Kansas in 1871 and established a small inn and grocery on the road between the town of Cherryvale and the settlement of Independence. The inn was a single-room structure divided by a canvas curtain. Guests sat at a table with their backs to the curtain. Behind the curtain was the family's living quarters. Behind the family's living quarters was a trapdoor. Below the trapdoor was a root cellar. In the root cellar, and in a shallow depression behind the inn that the Benders maintained as a kitchen garden, investigators found the bodies of at least 10 victims in May of 1873. Travellers who had stopped at the Bender Inn for a meal, a night's lodging, or a drink of water. Men, women, children. All killed the same way. Their skulls caved in, their throats cut. Some had been dropped through the trapdoor into the cellar while still alive. The Bender family fled sometime in the days before the bodies were discovered. Despite one of the largest manhunts in Kansas history, they were never officially found and never brought to justice. They were, for their time, America's first widely publicized family of serial killers. Historians have described Kate Bender, confident, charming, capable of disarming the suspicion of strangers, as particularly calculated in her role in luring victims. The Ingalls family stopped at the Bender Inn multiple times for water on trips between their homestead and Independence. Charles stopped there. He brought his daughters in the wagon. Laura, small and unaware of what was happening around her, once saw Kate Bender standing in the doorway of the inn. She was standing a few yards from where bodies were buried. She was a little girl and she did not know. But Charles knew the Benders. He had been to their inn. He had looked at them across a counter and accepted a cup of water and driven away, not knowing what lay beneath the surface of that ordinary prairie scene. When the bodies were discovered, when the community understood the full horror of what the Bender family had been doing, the shock was complete and violent. This was not anonymous danger. These were neighbours. People you had spoken to, bought goods from, nodded at in passing. The safety of the ordinary had been comprehensively shattered. And then there is what Laura told that 1937 audience. She said Pa rode out with the men who went looking for the Benders. Now, as we noted in the previous chapter, the timeline here is contested. The Ingalls left Kansas in 1870. The Bender murders were discovered in May of 1873, 3 years apart. Could Charles have returned? The Ingalls family was in Walnut Grove, Minnesota by 1874, but the period between 1870 and 1874 is not entirely accounted for in either the books or the historical record. A trip back to Kansas in 1873 is not impossible. It is also not confirmed. What Laura said is that Pa came home late that night, that when Ma asked whether the Benders had been found, Pa said, in a strange tone, those are Laura's words, a strange tone, that they would never be found. The Benders were, in fact, never found. 2 women who claimed to be Ma Bender and Kate Bender were arrested in 1889 in Michigan and brought back to Kansas for trial, but the case collapsed when witnesses could not definitively identify them as the actual Benders, and they were released. Multiple competing theories about the Benders' fate have circulated for over a century. That they escaped to Europe, that they changed their names and lived out ordinary lives, that they were killed by vigilantes in the weeks after the discovery and buried somewhere on the prairie without markers. If Pa rode with the vigilantes, if what he said in that strange tone was the truth of what had happened to the Bender family on a dark night in Kansas in 1873, then the man in the books, the patient, gentle, high-fair-minded Pa who played the fiddle and told stories by firelight and said that the only good Indian is not a dead Indian, that man had blood on his hands, frontier blood, extra-legal blood, the kind of blood that the law of 1873 might have excused but that no children's book could carry. Laura knew, and she left it out. There is one more neighbour we should meet before we leave Kansas behind. Cap Garland. We mentioned him in the Pay chapter, the teenager who rode through blizzards to bring wheat back to the starving town of De Smet. He was not a Kansas neighbour. He was a Dakota Territory neighbour, from the later part of Laura's story. But he belongs here because he represents something the books do, occasionally genuinely, and get right. Cap Garland was real. His heroism was real. His death. In 1891, at age 27, thrown 30 feet into the air when a threshing machine boiler exploded, was real. He was buried in the Willow Lake Cemetery in South Dakota. His sister Florence taught Laura and Carrie Ingalls in De Smet. His mother Margaret ran the boarding house that sat just behind the Ingalls building on the main street. He was not changed. He was not softened, composited, or erased. His name was his name. His deed was his deed. He stands in the books as one of the very few characters who appears essentially as he was, a brave, young, deeply ordinary kid who did an extraordinary thing and then went back to being ordinary until a piece of farm machinery ended his life on an August afternoon in 1891. Cap Garland is proof that the books could have been more honest throughout, that the people could have been named and kept and honoured as they were, that the composite and the erasure and the editorial softening were choices, not necessities, that somewhere in between the fictional Nellie Oleson and the real Cap Garland, there was a version of these books that could have told the whole truth. That version was never written. What we have instead is what we have, 60 million copies of a carefully curated mythology. And what we're doing tonight is reaching behind the mythology, through the census records and the birth certificates and the annotated manuscripts and the gravestone inscriptions, to find the people who were really there. They were all really there, every single one of them. And in the final chapter, we're going to talk about what happens now. What it means to love something and know its limits. What it means to hold a piece of art up to the light and see both its beauty and the shadows it casts. And what the real people of the Little House story, the neighbours, the erased, the composited, the softened, what they deserve from the millions of readers who have never known their names. Let us take a breath. We have covered a great deal of ground tonight. We have walked through schoolrooms in Walnut Grove, Minnesota, where 3 separate girls sat unaware that they would eventually be compressed into one fictional villain. We have stood in a Kansas cabin where a black doctor walked through the door and saved 5 lives and delivered a baby and received for his trouble 1 chapter and a misspelled name. We have read a census page that lists an English bachelor named Edmund Mason in Rutland Township, Kansas, a man buried near the famous cabin who became, in the books, a fictional Tennessean. We have followed a restless, charming, deeply human father across 14 moves in 20 years, and watched his daughter transform him into something steadier, wiser, and more comforting than the historical record quite supports. We have stood on Osage land and understood that the land never stopped being Osage land, no matter how many pioneer families built cabins on it, and we have sat with the image of Kate Bender standing in a doorway while a wagon full of Ingalls children rolled past, not knowing. Now we need to talk about what all of this means, not as an accusation, not as a verdict, but as a reckoning, the kind that honest reading demands. Here is the first thing to hold on to because it matters. The books are not fraudulent. Laura Ingalls Wilder did not sit down in 1930 with the intention of deceiving anyone. She sat down with a pencil and a stack of school tablets and tried to do something genuinely difficult, to remember a childhood experienced across multiple states and decades of time, and render it in a form that would be both honest and readable. She was 63 years old. She was reaching back 50 years. She was trying to make something out of the raw material of her life that would be worth the reading. That is a noble act, regardless of what shaped the result. And the result, it must be said, is often extraordinary. The Long Winter is a masterwork of sustained tension, 80 pages of blizzard, of slow starvation, of a town holding on by its fingernails, told from the inside by someone who was actually there and never forgot what the cold felt like. On the banks of Plum Creek captures a child's sensory world, creek water, tall grass, the smell of a gopher tunnel, with a precision that no amount of research could manufacture. These Happy Golden Years is, at its best, a love story written by a woman who genuinely loved the man she was writing about, and that love comes through on every page. The books are beautifully written. They are emotionally true in the way that good fiction is always emotionally true, even when the facts beneath it have been adjusted. What they are not is history. And for 90 years, a significant portion of the 60 million people who read them believe they were. That is the problem. The scale of the influence is almost impossible to overstate. Between 1932 and 1943, the 8 Little House novels were published and immediately adopted by American elementary schools as educational reading material. They were used not as historical fiction, with the appropriate caveat that fiction involves invention, but as windows into the actual pioneer experience. Generations of American schoolchildren learned about westward expansion primarily through Laura's eyes. Those children grew up. They became teachers who assigned the books to their students. They became politicians who invoked the pioneer spirit in campaign speeches. They became parents who handed the books to their daughters and said, "This is where we come from." And what they handed down without knowing it was a story that left out the Black Doctor, that minimized the Osage, that compressed 3 real women into one fictional bully, that made a restless and occasionally reckless man into a nearly perfect patriarch. What they handed down was a very specific argument about the American frontier, that it was won by white, self-reliant nuclear families who asked nothing of the government and received nothing from their neighbours except the occasional act of individual heroism. This was not true. It was never true. But it was believed, and it shaped the way Americans thought about themselves, about self-sufficiency, about government assistance, about race, about the land itself, for almost a century. Rose Wilder Lane would have considered that a success. She published The Discovery of Freedom in 1943, the same year the last Little House novel appeared, and it became one of the founding texts of the American libertarian movement. She considered the Little House books a demonstration of her political philosophy, proof that free individuals, left alone by the government to work their own land in their own way, could build something from nothing. The irony, which Rose seems never to have fully confronted, is that the Ingalls family's land was given to them by the government under the Homestead Act, which was itself one of the largest government programs in American history. The railroad that made settlement possible received massive federal subsidies and land grants. The land office where claims were filed was a federal institution. The soldiers who eventually attempted to evict illegal settlers from the Osage Reserve, and who ultimately failed to do so before the Osage themselves were removed, were federal employees. Self-sufficiency on the American frontier was built on a foundation of government programs, government land giveaways, and government military force. The myth of the rugged individual and the reality of the subsidized settler were never quite the same thing. But the books told the myth, and the myth was what people needed to believe. In 2018, after a long and careful deliberation, the American Library Association made the decision to remove Laura Ingalls Wilder's name from its prestigious Children's Literature Award. The award had been named for her since 1954. It became the Children's Literature Legacy Award instead. The reaction was fierce on both sides. Those who supported the renaming pointed to specific passages in the books, Ingalls saying she does not want to see any Indians, descriptions that reduced native peoples to threatening anonymous figures in the landscape, the systematic erasure of black contributions to pioneer life. They argued that a Children's Literature Award should not bear the name of an author whose work, however beloved, had caused real harm to the understanding and dignity of non-white communities. Those who opposed the renaming argued that removing Wilder's name was an act of historical erasure, that books must be understood in their context, that a woman writing in the 1930s about the 1870s could not be held to the standards of 2018, that the book's genuine virtues outweighed their blind spots, and that the baby was being thrown out with the bathwater. Both sides had real points. The truth, as it usually does, lives in the tension between them. The books are a product of their time, written by a woman who could not entirely escape the racial attitudes and political commitments of the 1930s. That is true. It is also true that those attitudes shaped what got included and excluded, and that what got excluded did real damage to the historical record, damage that generations of schoolchildren absorbed without questioning, because who questions a beloved children's book? The answer is We do, now, with the evidence in hand, not to destroy something beloved, 'tis to understand it fully. Here is what Dr. George Tann deserves. He deserves more than one chapter. He deserves his name spelled correctly. He deserves to be known as the neighbour who lived less than a mile away, who saved 5 lives from malaria, who brought Carrie Ingalls safely into the world on a hot August morning in 1870, when frontier childbirth was genuinely dangerous, and his skill genuinely mattered. He deserves to be remembered as a Civil War veteran, a homesteader, a physician who served his community for more than 30 years, regardless of the race or financial status of his patients. He deserves to be known by the arc of his whole life, not just by his connection to a white family's famous story. His grave stands in Independence, Kansas. The next time you think of the Little House books, remember his name, all the letters of it, George A. Tann. Here is what the 3 real Nellies deserve. Nellie Owens deserves to be remembered as a real woman who lived 80 years, who was a child in a Minnesota schoolroom in the 1870s, and did what children do. Staked out social territory, established hierarchies, made a girl from a poorer family feel the edge of class difference, and who then grew up, as children do, into a full and complicated adult life that was reduced, without her knowledge, to a villain's role in one of history's most widely read book series. Genevieve Masters deserves to be remembered as the sharp, intellectual, New York-proud girl who was far nastier than Nellie Owens and who died young, at 41, in Chicago, and was brought home to the Dakota soil she had walked on as a teenager. She was complicated. She was real. She was more than a literary device. Estella Gilbert deserves to be remembered as the woman whose brother Dave was the genuine hero of De Smet's Hard Winter, and whose own presence in Laura's social world was borrowed, renamed, and repurposed into villainy. She lived to 80. She may well have read the books. She deserved better. Here is what the Osage Nation deserves. They deserve the acknowledgement, explicit, clear, without softening, that the land the Little House books are set on was their land, not empty prairie, not open country waiting for brave pioneers. Their land protected by treaty, taken from them by a combination of illegal settler encroachment, government capitulation, and the relentless westward pressure of manifest destiny ideology. The Osage Nation exists today. They are in Pawhuska, Oklahoma. They have a government, a culture, a language, a history that did not end in 1873 when they were forced from Kansas. They survived. They continue. They are owed the courtesy of being seen as what they always were, the people whose land this was. Here is what Charles Ingalls deserves. He deserves to be remembered as a man, full, human, contradictory, loving, and flawed, and restless and charming. He deserves credit for the genuine warmth he gave his daughters, the music he played them, the stories he told, the love that was real and constant even when the decisions were poor. And he deserves the honesty of not being held to a standard of perfection that living human beings rarely achieve. He was not the part of the books. He was better in some ways. His love was more urgent, his humour probably more wicked, his relationship with his girls almost certainly more complicated than the books could contain. He was worse in some ways. His judgment was often poor, his wanderlust costly, his possible involvement in vigilante justice a shadow the books carefully kept off the page. He was, in other words, a person. And persons are harder to love than characters, because persons are capable of disappointing you in ways that characters are not. And here is what Laura Ingalls Wilder deserves. She deserves neither simple lionization nor simple condemnation. She was a writer of genuine talent who took the raw material of a difficult life and made something lasting from it. She made choices about what to include, what to change, what to erase, that reflected the prejudices, the politics, and the limitations of her time and her particular perspective. She was shaped by Rose Wilder Lane in ways that scholarship is still working to fully understand. She was writing for children, for a publishing market, for a specific historical moment, and the books she wrote were effective precisely because they fit their moment so well. She also wrote something that millions of women, girls really, many of them reading for the first time, found genuinely empowering. Laura is stubborn. Laura is brave. Laura refuses to say the word obey in her wedding vows because she has already decided she will be a partner, not a property. Laura works. She teaches school. She earns money. She insists on staying when her husband wants to keep moving. She is, in the context of women's literature in the 1930s, a remarkably strong female protagonist. That matters. It matters to the 60 million readers who found in her something to hold on to. The books are not simple. They are not simply good or simply harmful. They are both braided together, inseparable. And the real neighbours, the ones who were changed, softened, composited and erased, they are not simple either. They are the evidence of what the myth required to be true and what truth the myth required to leave out. Here is where we land. At the end of all this. If you love the Little House books, if you have loved them since childhood, if they are part of who you are, if they sit on your shelf with the spines worn from reading, then hold on to that love. It is not wrong. The things the books gave you, the sense of a world that demanded your full attention, the understanding that hardship can be survived, the picture of a family that loved each other in the middle of impossibility, those things are real and good and worth keeping. But keep them alongside the truth of who was really there. Keep Dr. George Tann alongside the chapter that erased him. Keep Nellie Owens and Genevieve Masters and Estella Gilbert alongside the fictional Nellie Olson. Keep the Osage Nation alongside the prairie that the books pretend was empty. Keep the real Pa, itchy-footed, charming, or occasionally reckless, fully human, alongside the Pa who played the fiddle by firelight and always seemed to know the right thing to say. Keep the whole truth. It is harder to hold than the myth, but it is heavier in the right way, the way that comes from carrying something real. The Little House books are one of the great American stories. The real neighbours are part of that story too. They were always there. Now you know their names. There is something we did not quite say about the Christmas chapter, the most famous chapter in Little House on the Prairie, the one about Mr. Edwards swimming the flooded creek to bring Christmas presents. And it deserves its own moment because it illustrates, more clearly than almost anything else in the series, how the books work at their best and most complicated. The chapter is chapter 12. It is titled Mr. Edwards Meets Santa Claus. In it, the Kansas winter has flooded Plum Creek. Not the Minnesota Creek where the family would later live, but a different creek. A Kansas Creek, making it impassable on the day before Christmas. Mr. Edwards, who had promised to go to Independence and shop for the girls' Christmas gifts, arrives at the Ingalls cabin soaking wet and grinning. He swam. He swam the flooded creek in December. Cold water, fast current, the whole terrifying distance, and then walked the remaining miles to the cabin, and he hands each girl her gifts from Santa Claus. For Mary, a tin cup, a candy stick, a heart-shaped cake, and a brand new shining penny. For Laura, the same. Laura wrote decades later that she could still taste the peppermint candy, that the penny caught the lamplight and seemed to glow like something magical, that it was the best Christmas she ever had. Now think about what is really happening in that scene, stripped of the narrative frame. The Ingalls family has nothing. They are on the frontier, in winter, in a small cabin, with almost no money and no nearby town. Christmas is coming, and there will be nothing for the girls, because getting to the store requires crossing a creek that is currently trying to kill anything that enters it. The situation is one of the ordinary, grinding ways in which frontier poverty manifests, not in a dramatic disaster, but in the quiet impossibility of small pleasures that other children take for granted. And then a neighbour, a bachelor with no children of his own, a man who has decided that these two little girls are going to have a Christmas whether the creek allows it or not, does something extraordinary. Not heroic in the way that Cap Garland is heroic, not dramatic in the way that Blizzard Survival is dramatic, just quietly extraordinary. He swims a freezing creek, he walks miles in wet clothes, he knocks on a door and grins and says Santa Claus asked him to bring this. That act of love, neighbour love, community love, The understanding that the measure of a frontier settlement was whether its strongest members carried the weaker ones through the hard moments is the real heart of the Christmas chapter, and it is real. Something like it happened. A real man did something like this for these real girls on a real Kansas Christmas. His name has been changed. His origin has been reassigned to a more romantically American state. He will reappear possibly in Dakota Territory a decade later. But the act itself, the swimming, the gifts, the grin at the door, that is true. That is the frontier as it actually was at its best moments. People deciding that a neighbour's children were going to have a Christmas, and making it happen regardless of what the Creek thought about it. The tragedy is not that the story was told. It is that the story was attributed to one beloved fictional individual rather than to the larger community truth it actually represents. That frontier survival was communal, that pioneers depended on each other in ways that the myth of rugged individualism has spent 90 years obscuring. Mr. Edward swam a creek for Christmas. Edmund Mason, or Fred Brown, or whatever his name actually was, swam a creek for Christmas. And in the swimming, he represented something larger than himself, the way ordinary people on the frontier routinely did extraordinary things for their neighbours, not because they were remarkable individuals, but because that was the only way any of them survived. The books turn that community practice into a character. Rose Wilder Lane, who believed deeply in the heroic individual over the collective, would have approved. But the truth is warmer and stranger and more beautiful than the myth. The frontier was not saved by lone heroes. It was held together by communities of people who swam freezing creeks for each other's children at Christmas. There is a woman in these books who has been almost completely silent throughout our entire conversation tonight. She deserves a moment of her own, even now, even at the end. Carolyn Lake Quiner Ingalls, Ma, was born in 1839 in Brookfield, Waukesha County, Wisconsin. She was educated by frontier standards unusually well. She had attended school, could read and write with ease, maintained a standard of household culture that involved actual books, china on the table, and insistence on proper grammar from her children at all times. She married Charles Ingalls in 1860 when she was 21 years old. She would not make another independent major life decision for roughly 40 years. That is not an exaggeration. It is a legal fact. Married women in the 1860s, 1870s, and 1880s had no right to own property, no right to refuse a husband's decisions about where the family would live, and no legal standing to oppose the 14 moves or the failed ventures or the illegal squatting, or the periods of grinding poverty that resulted from her husband's restless optimism. She was, in the eyes of the law, an extension of her husband's will. And yet, within that impossibly narrow space, she maintained something. You can see it in the books. The way Ma is always calm, always the steady centre of the family's emotional life, always the one who unpacks the china shepherdess from the barrel after every move and places it on whatever surface is available, and makes it into home. She carried the standards of civilization across 1,000 miles of prairie. She taught her daughters that language mattered, that cleanliness mattered, that the difference between an animal and a person was the willingness to maintain order in the midst of chaos. She did this while grieving a son who died in infancy, and whose death the books do not mention, while surviving the years in Burr Oak that the books erase, while watching her daughter Mary lose her eyesight at 14, and managing the terror and grief of that loss without, as far as historical records show, ever collapsing under it. She was extraordinary. She was also absolutely voiceless in the historical record. No diary survives, almost no letters. Her feelings about the 14 moves, about Kansas and Iowa and Minnesota and Dakota Territory, about what it cost her to follow a charming, restless man across the continent for 20 years, none of it is recorded in her own words. Laura tried to give her voice. The character of Ma in the books is recognisable, consistent, dignified. But it is Laura's perception of her mother, filtered through a daughter's love and a woman's understanding, not Caroline's own account. The silence of Caroline Ingalls is one of the louder silences in this entire story. Louder, in its way, than the silence of Dr. George Tann. Because Dr. Tann's erasure was an act of others. Other people chose not to record his story, not to honour his contributions, not to give him his full chapter. But Carolyn's silence comes partly from the structure of the world she lived in, a world in which women's inner lives were considered less important than the external record of their husbands' and fathers' deeds. She survived them all. Charles died in 1902, Mary died in 1928, and Caroline Ingalls died in 1924 at 84, in De Smet, South Dakota, the town she had last arrived in, and where finally the moving had stopped. She had outlasted the frontier. She had outlasted the poverty and the itchy feet and the blizzards and the grasshoppers and every other thing the Prairie had thrown at the family that carried her name across states she never asked to cross. She left no record of how it felt to stay still at the end, but she stayed. And in the staying, she outlasted everything. Before we reach the final chapter, there is one more small truth worth naming. A deliberate change to the historical record that does not involve erasure or compositing, but simply the quiet adjustment of a number. Almanzo James Wilder was born on February 13th, 1857. Laura Ingalls was born on February 7th, 1867. When they married on August 25th, 1885, Almanzo was 28 years old and Laura was 18. Their age difference was exactly 10 years and 6 days. In the books, specifically in these happy golden years and the first 4 years, Almanzo is presented as approximately 19 to 21 years old. He's described as not quite 21 when he files his homestead claim, which in the books is presented as the legal age threshold that matters. Much is made of how young he is, how close in age he and Laura are. Scholars have traced this change to what biographer Anne Remines identified as an editorial concern. A 28-year-old man courting a 15-year-old girl, which is when the courtship began, in the book's timeline, would raise eyebrows even in the 1940s when the later books were written, and considerably more raised eyebrows today. Even by reducing Almanzo's age to 19 or 20, the age gap becomes 4 or 5 years rather than 10 or 13, and the dynamic of the courtship shifts from something that modern readers might find uncomfortable to something that reads as charmingly youthful. This is a different kind of change from the erasure of Dr. Tann or the compositing of Nellie Olson. It is a softer kind, a recognition that historical realities do not always survive the journey into public consciousness unchanged, that some truths require adjustment to be accepted by the audiences of later eras. It also demonstrates something important. Wilder and Lane were sophisticated about their audience. They understood what would be accepted and what would not. They made adjustments with craft and deliberateness, not carelessly. Which means the larger choices, the one chapter for Dr. Tann, the composite villain, the erased Iowa period, the softened par, were not oversights. They were decisions, made by intelligent women who knew exactly what they were doing and why. That knowledge does not make the choices wrong, necessarily, but it does make them answerable. One final thing before tonight ends. There is a moment in Little House on the Prairie, early in the book, when the family has just arrived in Kansas and the wagon has stopped, and Pa is standing at the edge of his claim looking out across the prairie, where Laura describes the feeling of that land as something almost overwhelming. The sky going on forever, the grass taller than a man's head in some places. The silence that is not really silence, but is full of wind and insects and the distant cry of birds, and the particular sound that wide empty space makes when it is, in fact, not empty at all. She writes, "This was the farthest west they had come so far. Pa said there would be more blizzards and Indians and wild animals, but there would also be good hunting, and the land would be theirs. The land would be theirs." It is an extraordinary line in retrospect. Not because Laura was lying. She was 3 years old when that wagon stopped, and whatever Pa said in that moment, she received it as a child receives the pronouncements of a father, as the truth. It is extraordinary because we know now what she could not have known then. The land was not theirs. It was not going to be theirs. They would live on it for 16 months and then leave it, and the people whose land it actually was would be driven off it entirely 3 years later. The land would be theirs. That sentence is the Little House books in miniature. The hope, the confidence, the complete and innocent conviction that this prairie was there for the taking, that it was waiting for this family, that the future visible on the horizon was an open promise rather than a contested one. It is the sentence that 60 million readers received as children and carried into adulthood as a piece of American truth. The work of knowing better, of finding Dr. Tann and the 3 real Nellies and Edmund Mason and the Osage Nation and the real, complicated, fully human Charles Ingalls behind the fiddle, that work does not erase that sentence. It does not erase the hope in it. It does not reach back through time and correct the 3-year-old in the wagon, who was looking out at an overwhelming sky and feeling something she would spend the rest of her life trying to describe. What it does is place that sentence in a larger story, a truer one. The land was not theirs, but they loved it as though it were. They built something on it. Memory, story, connection, a child's experience of the world that became, in the hands of a gifted and complicated writer, one of the most enduring accounts of American frontier life ever put on paper. And all around them, in that same prairie landscape, there were neighbours. People the books changed. People the books erased. People the books reduced and composited and softened and left to fade in the historical record while the Ingalls family story lit up generation after generation of readers. Those neighbours were part of the land too. They worked it, treated it, crossed it in blizzard conditions, were buried in it, were displaced from it, delivered babies on it, saved families from dying on it. They were there. They were real. Now you know them. Go back to the books if you love them. Read them again, or read them for the first time. They are worth reading. They are worth the hours they will take and the feelings they will stir and the occasional, astonishing beauty of a sentence that gets the prairie exactly right. But read them with your eyes open. Read them knowing that the best Christmas in the series was given by a man whose name was changed, and whose grave most tourists drive past without stopping. That the villain was 3 women whose real lives were complicated and full and infinitely more interesting than their fictional composite. That the doctor who saved the whole family is buried with a grave marker that calls him the neighbour he actually was, not the passing stranger the books needed him to be. Read them knowing that the land was Osage land. Read them knowing that Pa was human. Read them knowing that somewhere between what Laura wrote and what really happened, there are dozens of real people waiting. Patient, unnamed, finally ready to be known. That is where tonight ends, not with the myth, with the neighbours.